There's a quiet kind of power in walking away, not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, the kind that happens when you finally choose peace over proving a point. At first, he didn't understand it. To him, it looked sudden, confusing, maybe even unnecessary, because when someone benefits from your presence, they rarely question it. But time has a way of revealing truths that words never could, and there comes a moment, slow, uncomfortable, undeniable, when he finally understands why you walked away. This is that moment. And here's what happens when it arrives. He realizes you were carrying more than you showed, and the realization doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't strike like lightning. It comes slowly, the way truth usually does, quiet, patient, unavoidable. At first, it shows up as discomfort, a strange weight in moments that used to feel normal, a pause where your voice used to be, a silence that feels heavier than any argument you ever had. When you were there, you didn't announce what you carried. You didn't list it out or demand recognition for it. You woke up and handled things because they needed to be handled. You absorbed tension so the room could stay calm. You softened your words so others wouldn't feel threatened. You listened, even when you were tired, even when your own thoughts were screaming for space. You learned the art of making strength look effortless, and that's the most dangerous kind because people mistake it for endless supply. He thought you were just like that, naturally strong, naturally patient, naturally okay. That's the illusion people fall into when someone loves deeply and quietly. They assume it costs nothing. They assume it doesn't take energy or restraint or self-negotiation. They don't see the internal math you do every day, what to say, what not to say, what to let go of, what to hold together. They don't see the way you talk yourself into staying calm when walking away would be easier. They don't see the nights you replay conversations, wondering if you asked for too much or accepted too little, and you never corrected them. Not because you didn't feel it, but because you believed carrying it was part of loving. So when you walked away, the first thing he noticed wasn't pain. It was inconvenience. Things felt off, unfinished, unbalanced. Small details started slipping through the cracks. The emotional temperature changed. Conversations lost their flow. Conflicts lingered longer. Decisions felt heavier. And he couldn't quite explain why. That's when the realization begins to form. He starts to remember moments he dismissed. Times you went quiet and he assumed you were fine. Times you changed the subject when it mattered. Times you said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. At the time, those moments felt like peace. Now they feel like warnings he didn't know how to read. Psychologists talk about emotional labor as one of the most invisible forms of effort. It's the work of managing feelings, yours and everyone else's, to keep relationships functional. Studies consistently show that the person who performs the most emotional labor is often the one least appreciated because their work prevents visible problems from ever surfacing. You were that person, the stabilizer, the buffer, the quiet center. You carried moods that weren't yours. You took responsibility for harmony you didn't break. You adapted again and again, telling yourself that flexibility was maturity, that patience was love, that endurance was strength, and maybe it was. But it was also heavy. He didn't see the weight because you never dropped it in front of him. Only after you left did gravity do its work. Now he feels things he never had to feel before. Emotional messes that don't get cleaned up automatically. Awkward silences that don't resolve themselves. Conflicts that don't dissolve just because time passes. He realizes that things used to work not because they were easy, but because you were doing the work to make them look that way. And that's a hard truth to face, because it means the relationship didn't fall apart suddenly. It means it was slowly being held together by someone who was getting tired. It means you didn't walk away on impulse. You walked away after carrying more than your share for too long. Real life confirms this pattern again and again. In long-term relationships, the partner who appears stronger is often the one absorbing stress silently. Research on burnout shows that people don't collapse when pressure begins. They collapse when it's sustained without relief or recognition. That's what happened to you. Not weakness. Accumulation. He starts to see that your smiles weren't proof that everything was fine. They were proof that you were trying, that your calm wasn't indifference, it was self-control, that your silence wasn't emptiness, it was exhaustion, and the realization hurts because it reframes everything. Moments he once took for granted now feel expensive. Your patience feels rare. Your presence feels irreplaceable. Not because you were perfect, but because you were intentional. You chose to show up fully, even when it cost you something. He begins to understand that you weren't asking for too much back then. You were asking for balance, for shared weight, for acknowledgement. You didn't need grand gestures. You needed awareness. You needed him to notice that strength doesn't mean invulnerability. But by the time he understands this, you're no longer there to explain it. That's another quiet lesson he learns. The strongest people rarely leave loudly. They leave after they've explained themselves in 100 small ways that went unnoticed. They leave after trying to adjust, to adapt, to make it work without making it dramatic. They leave when carrying more becomes losing themselves. He starts to see you differently now, not as someone who gave up, but as someone who finally set something down. And in that realization, there's regret, not the loud cinematic kind, the quiet kind that sits with you at night, the kind that shows up when you replay old conversations and suddenly hear what was actually being said, the kind that makes you realize that what you thought was normal was actually someone else's sacrifice. You didn't leave because you were fragile. You left because you were strong enough to recognize an imbalance and brave enough to stop carrying it alone. That truth stays with him. And even if he never says it out loud, even if it takes years for it to fully sink in, there will always be that moment when he understands that what you carried was love, patience, restraint, and effort, and that losing you wasn't sudden at all. It was the natural result of not noticing the weight someone else was holding for him every single day. He understands that love without respect is empty, but that understanding doesn't come when things are comfortable. It doesn't arrive during the good moments, the laughter, the shared routines, or the familiar warmth of knowing someone will be there. It comes later, when comfort is gone and all that's left is honesty. The kind of honesty that shows up when there's no one left to impress and no relationship left to protect. At first, he thought love was enough. That feeling was the proof. That intention mattered more than behavior. That as long as he cared in his own way, it should count. And for a long time, that belief protected him from looking deeper, because looking deeper would mean facing the moments he dismissed, the words he minimized, the boundaries he crossed without realizing or without stopping. You loved him, and that made him feel secure, too secure, secure enough to interrupt you, secure enough to delay apologies, secure enough to assume you'd always understand. He didn't see disrespect because it didn't look like cruelty. It looked subtle. It looked like forgetting, like postponing, like choosing convenience over consideration, like listening halfway and responding fully, like assuming your patience had no limit. You noticed it though, not all at once. It showed up as small pauses inside you, moments where something felt off, but you told yourself not to overthink it. You reminded yourself of his good intentions. You focused on the good days. You translated his silence into stress, his sharp tone into exhaustion, his broken promises into bad timing. You gave meaning to things he never explained because you believed love meant filling in the gaps. But respect is not something love can replace. Respect is showing up when it's uncomfortable. It's listening without preparing a defense. It's taking someone's feelings seriously, even when you don't fully understand them. It's the willingness to adjust behavior, not just apologize for it. Love says, I care about you. Respect says, I value you. And without that second part, the first one starts to feel hollow. He didn't realize that every time he dismissed something important to you, a small fracture formed. Every time he joked instead of addressing something serious, something weakened. Every time he made you feel like asking for more was asking for too much, something eroded. You didn't explode. You didn't threaten. You didn't dramatize. You adapted. And adaptation can look a lot like agreement if someone isn't paying attention. There's a reason studies on long-term relationships consistently show that mutual respect is a stronger predictor of lasting connection than chemistry or passion. Passion fades and returns. Chemistry fluctuates. But respect determines whether someone feels safe being fully themselves. Without it, love turns into effort, and effort turns into exhaustion. You began to feel that exhaustion quietly. You started choosing words carefully, not to communicate better, but to avoid conflict. You measured your emotions before expressing them, not because they were unclear, but because you didn't want to be misunderstood again. You became more understanding while feeling less understood. And that's a lonely place to be, even when you're not alone. He thought love meant you would stay. What he didn't realize was that respect was the reason you eventually couldn't. Walking away wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of clarity. You reached a point where you understood something deeply love that requires you to shrink, explain, justify, or endure being overlooked is not love that nourishes you. It's love that consumes you. When you left, he felt confused, because in his mind, nothing was that bad. And that's often the problem. Disrespect rarely announces itself loudly. It accumulates quietly. It lives in patterns, not incidents. And people who benefit from those patterns rarely notice them until they're gone. After you walked away, the emptiness didn't feel like heartbreak at first. It felt like silence, a strange absence of tension he didn't know existed. No one reminding him gently. No one adjusting emotionally. No one smoothing over moments that could have turned into something deeper. No one absorbing the impact of his words. And slowly, the truth began to surface. He replayed conversations differently now. He noticed how often you tried to explain yourself, how often you said, "I just need you to listen," how often you asked for small things that never seemed urgent to him. He started to realize that what you wanted wasn't dramatic change. It was basic consideration. Respect would have looked like believing you the first time. Respect would have looked like consistency. Respect would have looked like effort without being asked. Without that, love became something you were giving more of than you were receiving. He understands now that love without respect puts all the responsibility on one person. One person becomes the communicator, the forgiver, the adjuster, the emotional translator. The other gets to remain comfortable, unaware, unchanged. And that imbalance can't last forever. In real life, this is how many relationships end, not because love disappears, but because self-respect finally shows up. People don't leave because they stop caring. They leave because caring starts to cost them too much. You reach that point. And when he sees you now stronger, calmer, more grounded, it challenges his old beliefs. Because you're not bitter, you're not broken, you're not reaching back, you're moving forward. That's when it hits him that walking away didn't weaken you. It restored you. He understands now that love should never require someone to tolerate being dismissed. That respect is not about grand gestures or perfect behavior. It's about consistency in the small moments. About making someone feel seen even when it's inconvenient. About treating their emotions as real, not negotiable. And that understanding stays with him. It shows up in future interactions, in moments where he pauses before speaking, in moments where he listens a little longer, in moments where he recognizes that love isn't proven by words, but by how safe someone feels around you. He understands now that what you wanted wasn't too much. It was the bare minimum. And the reason he feels the loss so deeply is because losing you forced him to confront a truth he avoided for too long. Love without respect isn't love that lasts. It's love that teaches. And sometimes the lesson only lands after the person who needed respect the most has already walked away. He sees that you chose yourself, not someone else, but it takes time for that truth to settle in. At first, his mind reaches for easier explanations. Someone new, a sudden change of heart, a secret reason that has nothing to do with him. Those stories are more comfortable because they protect the ego. They turn your decision into something external, something he doesn't have to examine too closely. But as days pass and nothing dramatic appears, no public declarations, no rushed replacements, no attempts to provoke jealousy, the illusion starts to fade. What's left is something quieter and much harder to dismiss. You didn't leave to be rescued. You didn't leave to be chosen by someone else. You left because staying was costing you pieces of yourself you could no longer afford to lose. When you were still there, you gave more than you admitted. You stretched yourself to fit spaces that were slowly shrinking. You adjusted your expectations so often they began to feel like burdens instead of hopes. You convinced yourself that patience was maturity, that endurance was strength, that self-sacrifice was love. And for a while, those beliefs helped you survive. But survival is not the same as living. He didn't see that internal shift while it was happening. From the outside, you looked the same. You still showed up, still tried, still cared. But inside, something fundamental was changing. You were becoming aware of your own voice again, of your own needs, of the quiet discomfort that came from constantly choosing understanding over honesty. Psychologists often talk about self-abandonment as one of the most damaging patterns in long-term relationships. It happens when someone repeatedly ignores their own boundaries to preserve connection. Over time, this creates resentment, anxiety, and emotional fatigue. You felt that fatigue long before you ever mentioned leaving. You felt it in the pauses before responding, in the moments where you swallowed words instead of speaking them, in the growing sense that you were disappearing inside a relationship that was supposed to help you grow. When you finally walked away, it wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate, a decision built from countless small moments where you chose to stay quiet until silence became heavier than leaving. From the outside, it may have looked sudden. From the inside, it felt overdue. At first, he interpreted your absence as rejection. He thought it was about him not being enough, or about you wanting more than he could give. But slowly, a different understanding emerges. Because you don't behave like someone chasing validation. You don't try to prove you're happier. You don't seek attention. You don't rewrite history to make him the villain. You simply move forward. And that's what confuses him most. People who leave for someone else usually leave loudly. They justify, they compare, they explain. People who leave to choose themselves leave quietly. They don't need permission. They don't need applause. They don't need to be understood by everyone, only by themselves. He starts noticing changes in you that have nothing to do with romance. Your energy is different. Your presence feels grounded. You laugh more easily. You speak more honestly. You no longer over-explain or apologize for existing. Those are not the signs of someone who found another person to lean on. Those are the signs of someone who finally stopped leaning in the wrong direction. Real life supports this in ways that are easy to overlook. Studies on post-relationship growth show that individuals who leave relationships to prioritize mental and emotional well-being often experience increased confidence, clearer decision-making, and improved life satisfaction within months. Not because they found someone new, but because they reconnected with themselves. He begins to understand that your decision had nothing to do with replacing him. It had everything to do with reclaiming yourself. You didn't wake up one day and stop loving him. You woke up one day and realized love shouldn't require constant self-negotiation. That wanting peace doesn't make you cold. That choosing yourself doesn't mean you failed. It means you listened. And that realization didn't come easily. Choosing yourself meant letting go of familiar pain for uncertain freedom. It meant accepting loneliness over emotional neglect. It meant risking being misunderstood rather than continuing to be misaligned. Those are not easy choices. They are brave ones. He remembers moments now with new clarity. Times you tried to explain how you felt, only to be met with defensiveness or dismissal. Times you asked for small changes that never lasted. Times you pulled back emotionally, not to punish, but to protect yourself. At the time, he saw those moments as distance. Now he sees them as signals. He sees that you weren't asking him to save you. You were asking him to meet you. And when that didn't happen, you met yourself instead. That's the part that stays with him. You didn't leave behind chaos. You left behind clarity. You didn't run towards something new. You stood still long enough to realize you were allowed to want more for yourself, not from someone else. In a world that often teaches people to measure their worth by who chooses them, your decision quietly challenges that idea. You chose you. Not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. Not because you believed you were better than him, but because you believed you deserved better for yourself. And that truth settles in slowly for him, but it settles deep. He understands now that your healing didn't require a replacement. It required space. Space to breathe without explaining. Space to exist without adjusting. Space to grow without asking for permission. That kind of growth doesn't come from another person. It comes from alignment. When he finally sees it clearly, there's a mix of emotions. Regret, yes, but also recognition. Because on some level, he knows the courage it took. He knows how hard it is to walk away from something familiar, even when it no longer fits. He knows how easy it would have been for you to stay and continue compromising. But you didn't. And that's what changes the way he remembers you. Not as someone who left him for someone else, but as someone who loved herself enough to stop abandoning who she was meant to be. That understanding reshapes everything. It turns confusion into clarity. It turns loss into lesson. And even if your paths never cross again, the impact of your choice lingers. Because watching someone choose themselves without bitterness, without blame, without spectacle is powerful. It leaves a mark, and the mark it leaves is this simple, undeniable truth. You didn't walk away to find someone else. You walked away to finally come home to yourself. He feels the consequences of taking you for granted in ways he never expected, and not all at once. At first, it shows up as a strange imbalance, like something familiar has shifted but he can't quite name it. The days still move forward, the routines still exist, but something essential is missing. Not loud, not dramatic, just gone. And that absence has weight. When you were there, your presence felt constant, reliable. He didn't think of it as something that could disappear. You were the one who remembered the details, who checked in, who smoothed over tension before it turned into conflict. You brought stability without demanding recognition for it. Over time, that consistency became invisible, not because it lacked value, but because it was always there. That's how being taken for granted usually happens, not through cruelty, but through comfort. Through the assumption that someone will always show up the way they always have. Through the quiet belief that effort can be postponed, appreciation can wait, and apologies can come later. Later feels endless when you think someone isn't going anywhere. You notice the shift long before he did. You felt it in the moments where your efforts went unacknowledged. In the times you gave understanding but didn't receive it back. In the way gratitude slowly turned into expectation. You didn't ask for praise, you just wanted to be seen. And when that didn't happen, something inside you began to pull away. He didn't recognize that withdrawal while it was happening. To him, things still felt normal. That's the danger of taking someone for granted. You don't feel the loss until it's complete. The work they were doing quietly disappears, and suddenly you're left handling things you didn't even know they were managing. After you left, the consequences became clearer. Conversations felt heavier. Emotional tension lingered longer. Small problems turned into big ones because there was no one absorbing the impact anymore. He started noticing how often you had made space for his moods, his timing, his priorities. Without you, that space collapsed. Psychologists describe this as the absence effect. We only recognize the value of something when it's no longer present. Research on long-term relationships shows that perceived appreciation is directly linked to emotional security. When appreciation fades, connection weakens. Even if love remains, you felt that truth before he ever did. He remembers moments now that didn't seem important at the time. Times you showed up even when you were tired. Times you listened when you needed support yourself. Times you adjusted your needs to avoid conflict. Those moments felt ordinary back then. Now they feel rare. The hardest part for him is realizing that you didn't leave suddenly. You left after being consistently overlooked. After effort became one-sided. After care turned into obligation. You didn't walk away to punish him. You walked away because staying meant continuing to give without receiving. He feels the consequence in the quiet moments most, when something goes wrong and there's no calming presence to balance it, when decisions feel heavier because no one is sharing the emotional load, when he wants to talk and realizes he never learned how to listen the way you did. Real life reflects this pattern again and again. People often underestimate the emotional contributions of those who hold relationships together. Studies on relational burnout show that when one partner consistently gives without acknowledgement, withdrawal becomes inevitable. Not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. He begins to understand that what he lost wasn't just you. It was the version of life that worked because you were in it. Your patience, your consistency, your willingness to care even when it wasn't convenient. Those things can't be replaced easily because they weren't accidental. They were choices you made every day, and now he has to live with the space those choices once filled. There's regret in that realization, but it's a quiet kind. Not the dramatic regret of loss, but the reflective regret of understanding too late. He sees now that appreciation isn't something you express once in a while. It's something you practice consistently. And by the time he learned that lesson, you had already learned a different one, that you deserve to be valued without having to disappear first. He feels the consequence when he remembers how easily he assumed you'd always be there. How rarely he paused to consider what it cost you. How often he accepted your presence without honoring it. Those memories don't shout. They sit with him. And that's the real consequence of taking someone for granted, not just losing them, but understanding too late that what felt permanent was actually precious. He accepts that you didn't lose him, he lost you, but acceptance doesn't arrive easily. It doesn't come wrapped in clarity or calm. It comes after resistance, after denial, after replaying moments with a different lens and realizing the story he told himself no longer holds. At first, he believed you were the one who walked away, the one who gave up, the one who couldn't hold on. That version of the story made him feel safer. It let him stay the center of the narrative. But time has a way of rearranging truth. As distance grows, the emotions settle, and what remains is reflection. He begins to see that you didn't leave out of weakness. You didn't leave because you failed. You left because you reached a point where staying meant losing yourself. That distinction changes everything. Because losing someone who walks away is different from realizing someone escaped. He remembers how you used to show up. Not halfway, not conditionally, fully. You brought effort, patience, presence. You didn't treat love like a game or a transaction. You gave with intention, and he benefited from that more than he realized at the time. When someone gives consistently, it can feel like the standard. Not the gift it actually is. He sees now that while you were building, he was coasting. While you were growing, he was assuming. While you were adjusting, he was expecting. None of it felt harmful in the moment, because comfort rarely feels dangerous, but comfort without awareness slowly turns into neglect. You didn't lose him when you walked away. You reclaimed yourself. That's the part that takes him the longest to accept. He thought losing you meant you lost something valuable. He didn't understand that the loss ran in the opposite direction, because what you gained wasn't just freedom from pain, it was alignment. You gained your voice back, your energy, your sense of self, and he sees that now in the way you move through life without needing to explain yourself anymore. Psychology often points out that people confuse attachment with value. We assume the person who stays longer cares more, loses more, sacrifices more. But in reality, The one who leaves after giving their all often loses the least because they leave with clarity. The one who stays comfortable loses the opportunity to grow until the loss forces it. He feels that forced growth now. He recognizes that you didn't walk away to make a statement. You walked away because the statement had already been ignored. You tried in ways that didn't demand attention. You expressed concerns gently. You hoped change would come through understanding rather than ultimatums. When it didn't, you chose honesty over hope, and that honesty looked like leaving. He sees how rare that kind of courage is. It's easy to stay where things are familiar, even if they hurt. It's harder to leave when love is still present, but respect and balance are not. You chose the harder path, not to prove a point, but to protect your future. Now, when he looks back, he notices the signs he overlooked. The way you slowly stopped explaining yourself, the way you pulled your energy inward, the way your efforts became quieter, not because you cared less, but because you were tired of giving where it wasn't being received. Those weren't signs of detachment. They were signs of preparation. You were preparing to choose yourself. He understands now that when you left, you didn't fall apart. You didn't spiral. You didn't reach back for validation. You rebuilt. And that reality disrupts the idea that he was the prize. It forces him to face something uncomfortable but true. You were never dependent on him. You were invested. There's a difference. Investment is a choice. Dependency is a need. You stayed because you chose to. You left because you chose to. That choice is power. And power doesn't disappear when a relationship ends. It becomes more visible. He accepts now that you didn't lose him because you didn't lose anything that aligned with who you were becoming. What you lost was weight. What he lost was value. Not just the value of a relationship, but the value of having someone who showed up with consistency and care. That understanding brings regret, but it also brings humility, because regret isn't always about wanting someone back. Sometimes it's about realizing you didn't become the person you needed to be while you had the chance. He sees now that your absence isn't a gap waiting to be filled. It's a mirror, one that reflects what he failed to appreciate when it mattered. And that reflection stays with him, not as punishment, but as truth. You didn't lose him when you walked away. You gained clarity, strength, and self-respect. He lost the chance to grow alongside you. And accepting that truth is the final step in understanding what really ended. Not the relationship, the imbalance. The moment he understands why you walked away is not the moment you return. It's the moment you've already healed.